She was carrying a bottle of wine when she realized the man at table 12 was going to die before dessert arrived. Not a feeling, not a guess. A memory Noah, 19 years old, his kidneys shutting down after something colorless and quiet got under his skin on a loading dock. The doctor said it entered through contact, that by the time symptoms arrived, the damage was already done. Emily Carter looked down at her fingertips. Something clear and faintly sticky had transferred from the underside of the table onto her skin. She had maybe 4 minutes to decide what to do with that. If you've never had to choose between your safety and someone else's life, stay with me, because this story is going to show you exactly what that looks like. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this has traveled. Emily Carter had learned by the age of 29 that the most dangerous rooms in the world were not the ones that looked dangerous. Dangerous rooms had obvious exits. People in dangerous rooms were allowed to be afraid. Dangerous rooms didn't serve $40 appetizers or light candles that cost more than her grocery budget for the week. The harbor room was the most dangerous room she had ever worked in, and it looked like something out of a magazine spread about the good life. She had been carrying trays through that dining room for 11 months. She knew every booth, every light bulb, every creak in the service corridor floor. She knew which customers overtipped because they felt guilty about something and which ones undertipped because they had always believed servers were a lesser species. She knew the sound the kitchen made when a cook was having a bad night, and she knew the particular silence of a room that had stopped being a restaurant and turned into something else entirely. That silence arrived at 8:47, and Emily felt it before she could name it. She was coming out of the wine corridor with a Cabernet Sauvignon in her right hand when the skin on the back of her neck tightened. Not fear, not yet, just recognition. The same animal awareness she had developed after years of working rooms, where rich men got drunk and forgot that the people serving them were still in the building. She slowed. She looked. The private dining room at the far end of the restaurant, the alcove, the staff called it because it was separated from the main floor by a frosted glass partition and a standing reservation that rotated between 5 names she had been told never to discuss, was occupied tonight by Victor Kane. She knew who Victor Kane was because Martha had told her that morning in the tone Martha used when she wanted her staff to understand something without having to say it plainly. Victor Kane's party has the alcove tonight, Martha had said, not looking up from her clipboard. Full service, best linen. No one goes in there unless I send them, and no one lingers. You pour, you back away, you come out. Understood. Emily had understood. Victor Kane ran Kane Logistics, which, depending on who you asked, was either the largest private freight operation on the Eastern Seaboard or a financial architecture built on top of something the FBI had been trying to prove for 9 years. The news articles never quite convicted him. The profiles described him as formidable. His employees, from what she had heard, described him as a man who did not repeat himself. What Martha had not told her, what Emily had pieced together from the behavior of the men who arrived an hour before Kane himself, was that tonight's dinner was not a celebration. It was a negotiation. And negotiations of this kind in rooms like this with men who stood near exits and never touched their phones and watched the middle distance like they were running calculations did not end the way regular business dinners ended. Emily poured the Cabernet at the main floor table, accepted the compliment from the couple in booth 7 without really hearing it, and began her next circuit of the room. She was not supposed to be watching the alcove. She watched it anyway. Victor Kane sat at the center of the table with the particular stillness of a man who had trained himself never to move unnecessarily. He was in his early 50s, broad across the shoulders with silver at his temples, and the kind of face that had probably never been described as warm. He held his wine glass by the stem and did not drink from it unless he was making a point. Across from him sat Daniel Voss. Emily had not been briefed on Daniel Voss, but she did not need to be. She had served enough men like him to recognize the type immediately. He was the kind of man who entered a room and immediately made you feel like he had already been there, like the room had been arranged for his comfort specifically. He smiled a great deal. He used first names. He touched your forearm when he was making a point, and the touch was perfectly calibrated, warm enough to disarm, brief enough to maintain dignity. Charm of that precision was always manufactured. Emily had learned that the hard way. Between the 2 men sat whatever they were negotiating over, and around them stood 4 others, 2 on Kane's side, 2 she did not recognize, ranged with the geometry that was too deliberate for ordinary security. She noted the positions. She moved on. The night continued. Emily worked the main floor, kept her sections covered, smiled at the appropriate moments, laughed at the appropriate volume. She was good at her job in the specific way that people who could not afford to lose their jobs became good at things through grinding anxious precision rather than natural gift. Her mother had called that afternoon, the third call that week. The landlord had sent another notice, and the grace period was ending. Emily had told her it was handled, which was not true, but was the only thing that kept her mother's blood pressure in a range the doctors considered acceptable. Noah had texted her a meme about dolphins. He did that when he was having a good pain day. She had sent one back and tried not to calculate how much longer she needed to pick up overtime shifts before his physical therapy balance would be clear. She was thinking about the physical therapy balance when Martha appeared at her elbow. "Kane's table needs the Cabernet topped off," Martha said quietly. "The server I had on the alcove called in sick. I need you to cover it for the next rotation." Emily looked at her manager. "Me, don't make a thing of it." Martha's voice was controlled but thin at the edges, the way it got when she was handling something she did not want to be handling. "You go in, you top off the glasses, you make sure the bread service is current, you come out, fast and quiet." "Martha," Emily kept her voice low, "is everything okay in there?" "Everything is fine." Martha said it the way people said everything is fine when they had decided that believing it was easier than examining the alternative. "Just go." Emily took the wine and went. The alcove smelled like candle wax and cedar and the particular staleness of a room where important men had been performing composure for several hours. She pushed through the partition door, adjusted her expression to the service neutral she had practiced until it was automatic, and began her circuit of the table. Nobody looked at her. That was the thing about being a server in a room like this. The invisibility was absolute. She could have been furniture. She could have been part of the architecture. The men at the table registered her presence the way they registered the ambient music, as something managed, something arranged, something that did not require acknowledgement. She worked the glasses in order, starting from the far end, moving efficiently. She kept her movements small and deliberate. She watched the bread basket, assessed the butter, mentally noted the pacing. And then she reached Victor Kane's end of the table. She leaned forward to top off his glass, and as her left hand steadied herself against the edge of the tablecloth, her fingertips dipped below the overhang of the linen and made contact with the underside of the table. Wet. She paused for less than a second. No one noticed. She continued pouring. She withdrew her hand. She completed the circuit. She walked out of the alcove with a perfectly neutral expression and a sensation climbing her spine that she had not felt since she was 23 years old and sitting in a hospital corridor outside Noah's room while a nephrologist explained in the careful language doctors used when they were preparing families for the worst that her brother's kidneys were failing. The compound the doctor had said was a skin absorption agent. It had been present in a cleaning solvent used on the loading dock where Noah worked. Industrial, quiet, invisible on contact. By the time his body showed symptoms, the exposure was already 8 hours old. Emily stood in the service corridor, turned her left-hand palm up under the strip lighting, and looked at her fingertips. Clear, almost imperceptible. But there, Pamoya, her pulse was in her throat. She pressed her back against the wall and breathed through her nose. Thought about it again. A substance applied to the underside of a table positioned at the end, where a specific man habitually rested his hand, would be invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. It would transfer on contact. It would not cause immediate reaction. By the time Victor Kane left the restaurant tonight, by the time he was in his car or his hotel room or whatever protected space he occupied, whatever had been placed on that table would already be working. And Daniel Voss would be sitting across from him at another negotiation table by tomorrow morning, and the question of what had happened to Victor Kane would be answered by men with attorneys and resources and control of the narrative. While the servers got interviewed, while the kitchen staff got detained, while Martha stood in a police precinct and tried to explain how she had not known and nobody important believed her, Emily went to the bathroom and washed her hands. Twice. Then she stood at the sink and looked at herself in the mirror, which was something she generally tried not to do on double shifts because she looked like someone who had not slept properly in 18 months, which was accurate. She thought about calling the police. She was not naive. She understood that by the time a patrol unit arrived, this room would contain some of the most powerful private legal representation in the state, and the investigation would proceed in whatever direction was most convenient for the people who could afford to make it convenient. Her word, a waitress with rent, debt, and a brother with a medical file against whatever architecture Daniel Voss had constructed around tonight. She thought about telling Martha. Martha would panic quietly and do whatever minimized liability for the restaurant, which might mean doing nothing or might mean saying the wrong thing to the wrong person, and either outcome could turn dangerous before Emily had time to recalibrate. She thought about pulling Ethan Reeves aside, Kane's head of security, the one with the close-cut hair and the earpiece who had held the door when she came in and said nothing, and looked at everything. He seemed competent, but competent could mean compromised. She had no way to know whether Ethan Reeves was the reason this thing had been set up so cleanly or the reason it might be stopped. She dried her hands. She went back out. The dinner was progressing. Daniel Voss was telling a story. She could hear fragments of it through the partition as she moved past something about a shipping contract, some delayed resolution that had turned profitable. He had the room's attention. He was very, very good at having rooms. Victor Kane was listening with the expression of a man who had heard many versions of many stories and was running a private assessment of which version he was currently receiving. Emily positioned herself near the bread station, where she had a partial sightline into the alcove through the frosted glass partition. She watched Victor's right hand. Every few minutes, without apparent awareness of it, he drifted his right hand toward the edge of the table. Not to rest it there, more like a habitual grounding gesture. The way people touched door frames or desk edges without thinking about it, something his body defaulted to in moments of concentration. The first time she saw it, her stomach dropped. The second time, she made herself breathe. The third time, he almost made contact, and she took a step toward the partition before stopping herself with her hand pressed flat against her own sternum, feeling her heart knock hard against her ribs. Not yet. She did not know what not yet meant. She only knew she was not ready. She did not have the words. She did not have the plan. She did not have anything except the terrible clarity of what she had felt under that table and what her memory had done with it instantly. A busboy named Carlos materialized beside her. "You okay? You look like you're gonna be sick." "I'm fine," she said. "Can you cover table 9 for 2 minutes? I need to check something." Carlos looked at her. He was 19 and paid attention. "You sure you're okay?" "Carlos," she held his gaze. "Table 9. He went. She stood alone in the service corridor and thought about what she was actually weighing. On one side, a powerful man who might or might not deserve saving, who operated in industries that had consequences for people like her brother, who existed in a world so far above hers that his survival or death would rearrange fortunes she would never touch. On the other side, herself, her record, her job, her mother, Noah. The 3 other servers on tonight who had nothing to do with any of this and would be standing in the same precinct she would. She thought about the prep cook in the kitchen who was not supposed to be in the country and had said nothing about it and was terrified every single day of his life. She thought about the dishwasher who was 61 years old and supporting his daughter's family because his son-in-law had been laid off. She thought about Martha, who was not a brave person but was a fair one, who had never once shorted a paycheck or looked the other way at a customer who crossed a line, who deserved better than to be standing in a room full of investigators explaining how she had managed to let a man get poisoned in her restaurant on her watch. Emily had spent 29 years learning how to be invisible, how to occupy the background of rooms where decisions were made, how to move through danger by becoming unremarkable. The question she was confronting now was not whether she was brave enough to act. The question was what she would be in the silence on the other side of tonight if she chose not to. She picked up a clean napkin from the folded stack on the service shelf and walked toward the alcove partition. She pushed through the door. The table was at the coffee and closing conversation stage. Plates cleared, glasses low. The ambient warmth of a meal successfully performed by all parties, even if the performance was something other than what it appeared. Daniel Voss was in the middle of a sentence about Q3 projections. Emily moved to the dessert staging position near Victor Kane's right side, the way she would if she were about to present the evening's dessert options or offer a coffee refill. Professional placement. Unremarkable. She had done it 1,000 times. She set the napkin on the edge of the tray stand. She leaned forward slightly, adjusting the position of his water glass by 1/2 an inch, which was a thing servers did so often it registered as part of the furniture. She did not look at him. She spoke at a volume calibrated for the space between his ear and her mouth, and no further. "Don't touch under the table." Then she picked up the tray, stand tucked it under her arm, and walked toward the service exit at a pace that was neither fast nor slow. She heard Daniel Voss continue his sentence. She heard the ambient room sounds resume. She heard nothing unusual at all. She pushed into the corridor and stood with her back against the wall and felt like every single bone in her body had turned to cold water simultaneously. She had done it. She had no idea what she had done. She did not know if he had heard her. She did not know if he had believed her. She did not know whether Daniel Voss had been watching Victor's face at the exact second she had spoken and whether his instincts, the instincts of a man who had planned something this precise, had told him what had just happened. She did not know whether someone was already moving toward her. She picked up a coffee carafe from the service station because her hands needed something to hold, and she walked back to the main floor and she began refilling cups at table 7 with the mechanical precision of someone whose body was operating on a completely different track than her mind. The couple at table 7 asked if the creme brulee was house-made. Emily told them yes, everything was house-made. They seemed delighted. She smiled. And then from the corner of her eye through the frosted partition glass, she watched Victor Kane reach for his wine glass. Pause looked down at the table for a moment that lasted approximately 1 second and contained a lifetime, and then lift his hand and set it very deliberately in his lap. He did not touch the edge. He looked up at Daniel Voss and said something. She could not hear it through the glass. But she watched Daniel Voss's face and she watched the smile stay on it a half second too long in the way that smiles did when the person behind them was recalculating very quickly, and she knew. He had heard her. He had believed her. And whatever happened next would not be quiet. The coffee carafe in Emily's hand had gone cold without her noticing. She had been standing at the edge of the main floor for 6 minutes, she knew, because she had counted. The seconds had needed something precise to hold on to, watching the frosted glass of the alcove partition, the way you watched a pressure gauge on a piece of equipment you were not certain would hold. Victor Kane had not moved from his chair. Daniel Voss had not moved from his. Whatever Victor had said after she walked away, whatever calculation had happened in that room, in the 60 seconds since she whispered 4 words into the side of his head, had not yet produced anything visible from where she was standing. The partition swallowed sound. She could see shapes, and she could see that the shapes had not rearranged themselves into something that looked like chaos. That either meant everything was fine, or it meant the kind of men who arranged poisonings at dinner tables were also the kind who were trained to look fine while everything fell apart. Carlos appeared at her shoulder again. Table 4 is asking about the check. I'll get it, she said. You've been standing here for like 6 minutes. I'm aware, Carlos. You want me to? I said, I'll get it. She heard her own voice come out sharper than she intended and immediately softened it. Sorry, I'm sorry. Long night. Carlos looked at her for one more second, the particular look of a 19-year-old who was smarter than people gave him credit for and knew something was wrong but understood the rules well enough not to push, and then he went back to the floor. Emily got the check for table 4. She smiled at the couple. She processed the card. She said, of course, when the man said he hoped they would be back, and absolutely when the woman said the sea bass had been remarkable, and she moved through all of it on the surface of herself while underneath the clock was running. Because that was the thing she understood now, standing in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday night in a restaurant that had stopped being ordinary somewhere around 8:47. She had set something in motion and she had no idea where it was going, and she was the only person in this building who knew what she had done. That knowledge sat in her chest like something swallowed wrong. She went back to the service station and poured herself a half-inch of water and drank it. Thought about Noah. Did not know why she thought about Noah in that specific moment, except that Noah had always been the one who said the obvious thing and out loud when everyone else in the room was deciding whether the obvious thing was safe to say. He had been like that since he was 12 years old. It had gotten him into trouble. It had also gotten him out of it. She had always been the other kind, the one who weighed it first. She was still weighing it now, except the scale had already tipped and there was nothing to do but wait for the weight to distribute itself across whatever came next. Martha materialized from the direction of the kitchen. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was managing 3 problems at once and refusing to acknowledge any of them directly. She stopped next to Emily and did not look at her. How are they in the alcove? She asked. Fine when I came out, Emily said. Any issues? The word issues sat between them like a loaded piece of furniture. Emily looked at her manager's profile. Martha was 56 years old and had been running this floor for 19 of those years, and she knew this restaurant the way a ship's captain knew a hull every sound, every lean, every subtle wrongness that preceded something worse. She was afraid tonight. Emily could feel it radiating off her in short, contained waves. "No issues," Emily said. Martha's jaw moved slightly. "Good. Keep it that way." She walked back toward the host station without another word, and Emily watched her go and understood something she had not quite articulated before Martha knew something was wrong in that room. Not the specifics, not what Emily knew, but something. And she had made the calculation that the safest version of tonight was the one where her staff stayed ignorant and her head stayed down. Emily did not blame her for a bit. She also understood clearly and without sentiment that Martha was not going to be any help, which meant Emily was still alone in this, and the partition across the room was still frosted and still silent, and she had no idea whether the 4 words she had spoken had landed like a lifeline or like a lit match dropped into something flammable. Then the alcove door opened. Not a server, not a busboy, Ethan Reeves. He came through the partition at the measured pace of a man who had been taught never to move fast enough to cause alarm, and he walked directly across the main floor toward the service corridor, with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes doing a sweep of the room that lasted less than 3 seconds and covered every person in it. His eyes landed on Emily for exactly one of those seconds. She did not look away. She had learned years ago that looking away was the thing that made you memorable. He walked into the service corridor and the door swung shut behind him. Emily's heart was now somewhere in the vicinity of her collarbone. Ethan Reeves had not gone to the bathroom. The bathrooms were in the opposite direction. He had not gone to find Martha. Martha was visible at the host station, and he had walked past her without acknowledging her. He had gone into the service corridor, which connected to the kitchen, which connected to the rear exit, which connected to the alley where the delivery trucks came in. Emily waited 45 seconds. Then she picked up a linen rack as cover and followed him. The corridor was empty when she pushed through the door. She could hear the kitchen on the other side of the wall, the clatter and the heat, and the compressed language of a professional kitchen at the tail end of dinner service. She moved down the corridor toward the rear listening. She heard Reeves's voice before she saw him. He was on the phone standing near the rear exit, speaking in the low-control register of someone who had made many difficult calls in many unsecured locations. "It's been compromised," he said. "I don't know how, but he knows. He absolutely knows." A pause. "No, he's calm. That's the problem. He's completely calm, which means he's already 3 moves ahead of wherever you think you are right now." Another pause longer. "You need to understand something." Reeves's voice dropped another register. "If he walks out of this restaurant tonight, this is over, not delayed. Over. I've worked for this man for 11 years. When he gets quiet like this, something ends. The question is whether it's you or him." Emily stood motionless in the corridor with a linen rack in both hands and felt the bottom of the evening shift several feet further down. Ethan Reeves was not compromised. He was on Victor Kane's side, had been all along, and he had already figured out that something had gone wrong with whatever Daniel Voss had arranged. He just did not know what had gone wrong or how, which meant he did not know about her, which meant she was still invisible, which meant she was also the only person in this building who possessed 2 pieces of information, simultaneously what had been placed under that table and where Reeves's loyalty actually sat. She backed up 6 steps and returned to the main floor before Reeves finished his call, and she set the linen rack down and picked up a coffee carafe and resumed the steady, unremarkable motion of a woman doing her job. Her hands were trembling slightly. She gripped the carafe handle and made them stop. At table 9, a man in a blue blazer asked her if they were still doing the dessert special. She told him yes, the chocolate souffle. It needed 20 minutes advance notice. He said perfect, they'd have one. She wrote it down. She was writing it down when Daniel Voss laughed. She heard it through the partition, not the words, just the sound, and something about the quality of it was wrong. Too bright, too practiced. The laugh of a man who was recalibrating under pressure and using warmth as camouflage because warmth was the instrument he was best at, and he had been using it so long it had become reflex even when he was afraid. He was afraid. She could hear it somehow through the laugh itself. Victor Kane had heard her. And Victor Kane, who did not repeat himself and who got quiet when he was 3 moves ahead, had said something in that room that had made Daniel Voss understand that the evening had not gone the way it was supposed to go. And now Daniel Voss was laughing because men like Daniel Voss did not show you they were frightened. They performed until they found a door. The only question was which door he was moving toward. Emily glanced toward the alcove. Then she glanced toward the main entrance. Then she looked at the two men she had clocked earlier on Voss's side of the room, the one near the emergency exit and the one who had positioned himself casually near the wine corridor, and she realized with a cold-dropping clarity that they had both shifted. Not far, maybe 3 feet each. But their angles had changed. They were no longer watching the room the way you watched a room to protect it. They were watching the room the way you watched a room when you were working out whether you had time to do something before anyone reacted. Her mind ran the geometry of it in about 4 seconds. If Daniel Voss had understood from Victor's behavior that the dinner had failed, that whatever he had arranged under that table was now known, his options had narrowed to one. He could not walk out of this restaurant and into the open air with Victor Kane still alive and aware. That left him with whatever time remained inside the room and 2 men positioned to use it. Emily set the coffee carafe on the nearest service station. She walked toward the alcove partition. She was not running. She was not panicking. She was moving with the purposeful, moderately hurried pace of a server who had just remembered something about the table she needed to address before the next course beat at her there. She had done it 1,000 times. Nobody on the main floor would clock it as anything other than professional. She pushed through the partition door. The room looked exactly the same as it had when she had left 11 minutes ago, and that was the most terrifying version of it. Victor Kane at the center table still, Daniel Voss across from him still, the 2 men on Kane's side of the room unchanged, and Daniel Voss wearing a smile that was working very, very hard. Victor looked up when she entered. His eyes were the color of winter lake water, and they registered her in a way that was different from before. Not the unseeing register of a powerful man cataloging furniture, but the specific attention of someone who knew he was looking at a variable he had not yet placed. She felt it hit her like a hand pressed flat against her sternum. He knew she had spoken to him. He had processed it, and now he was looking at her the way you looked at a piece of information you did not yet know how to classify. She did not look at him. She looked at the table. She looked at the bread basket. She reached forward, lifted the basket, and said in the most ordinary voice she owned, "Can I bring you a fresh one of these, please?" said Daniel Voss. She took the basket and turned to go, and as she passed the chair nearest the partition, the one currently occupied by one of Kane's men, a broad-shouldered, quiet man named she had gathered from an earlier exchange as Garrett, she let her free hand drop to the side and without breaking stride touched the back of his chair twice with 2 fingers. Garrett did not react visibly, but when she pushed back through the partition, she heard very quietly behind her the sound of a chair being adjusted, repositioned, a body moving from settled to ready. It might mean nothing. It might mean Garrett was the kind of man who understood signals from unscheduled sources when they arrived during dinners that were not proceeding as intended. She did not know. She had spent a 30-second calculation on whether to do it and then done it because doing nothing had already proven itself to be its own kind of decision, and she had made her peace with the other kind. She went to the kitchen and stood at the bread station and gripped the counter with both hands and breathed. The soufflé timer for table 9 read 16 minutes. Carlos came in for a water refill and saw her face and did not say anything, which was the most considerate thing anyone had done for her all evening. She thought about Noah again, about the hospital, about the way her mother had sat in that corridor for 14 hours without eating or drinking anything, because she believed that if she got up, something would happen. Like her body being in that chair was a weight that held the balance. Like faith and proximity were the same thing. Emily had always thought that was magical thinking. She had sat beside her mother and held her hand and believed in the doctors and the machines and the specific compounds they were administering through the IV, and she had thought her mother was bargaining with something that didn't listen. She was not sure now. She had pressed 2 fingers against the back of a chair and trusted that it would mean something to the right person. That was not so different from her mother sitting in a hospital corridor for 14 hours. Maybe trust was always a little bit magical. Maybe you did it anyway. She picked up the bread basket and went back to the floor. And that was when she heard Victor Kane's voice through the partition, clear enough to carry despite the frosted glass, because Victor Kane had decided with the exact disciplined timing of a man who had been waiting for his chosen moment to stop performing. "Daniel." One word, said the way you said someone's name when you had finished all other versions of the conversation. A pause, then Victor again. "I want to ask you something directly." The main floor had the ambient noise of a restaurant. It wasn't loud, but the partition wasn't soundproofed, and Victor Kane was no longer modulating his voice for a social dinner. He was using a different register now. Lower, unhurried, the register of absolute certainty. In 12 years, Victor said, I have sat across a table from some extraordinarily dangerous people. I have done it without a weapon, and without a lawyer, and without anything but my ability to read a room. A pause. I have never been wrong about a room. Emily stood 6 feet from the partition and held the bread basket and did not move. I am not wrong tonight, Victor said. The silence that followed lasted long enough that the man at table 9 looked up from his menu. Then Daniel Voss said brightly and clearly, Victor, I have no idea what you're don't. Victor's voice did not rise. It simply closed the door on the sentence. Do not finish that. I have given you the courtesy of a private room and a quiet conversation. Do not make me regret the courtesy. Emily felt something shift in the room that she couldn't see but could feel the same way you could feel a barometric change before weather arrived. Something structural. Something about the arrangement of power in that room had just moved several inches in a specific direction, and everybody inside it had felt it, whether or not they would have known how to articulate what they'd felt. She walked back to the kitchen. The soufflé timer read 9 minutes. Her phone buzzed in her apron pocket. Her mother. She silenced it without looking at the screen and stood in the kitchen, noise and thought, with a clarity that surprised her. I have to get the rest of these people out of this, not out of the restaurant. She couldn't clear the restaurant without causing exactly the kind of chaos that would give Daniel Voss's men a cover they could use. But the servers, the kitchen staff, the dishwasher who was 61 and supporting his daughter's family, the prep cook who was terrified every single day. She needed them as far from the alcove end of the restaurant as the physics of service would allow without it being conspicuous. She found Carlos at the ice station. I need a favor. Yeah, he said immediately. She looked at him. You don't know what it is yet. I trust you, he said. What do you need? She told him to take the next 2 rounds on the far end of the floor tables 1 through 6 and to ask Brenna to cover 7 through 10. She told him to keep the kitchen orders moving and to make sure Raymond, the dishwasher, stayed on the far side of the line. She said there was a situation developing in the alcove and she didn't know what it was, but she wanted people clear of that end of the building. Carlos processed this in about 4 seconds. Should I call someone? Not yet, she said. Not unless I come back and tell you differently. If I come back and say call, you call immediately. You understand. Don't wait. Don't check with Martha. Okay, he said. He was 19 years old and he said okay like a person who had been waiting for someone to tell them the right thing to do. Thank you, she said. She went back to the floor. The alcove was quiet. Then it wasn't. She heard something that was not a voice and not a chair, a sound that didn't belong to a restaurant short and contained like something being moved with more force than it was supposed to be moved with. Not violent, not yet, but close to the edge of it. And then Ethan Reeves came through the main entrance at something between a walk and something faster, and he went straight through the main floor without looking at anyone, and he pushed through the alcove partition without slowing, and the door swung hard on its hinge and came back and settled, and the restaurant was quiet again. Emily stood in the middle of the main floor with a bread basket in her hands. The couple at table 7 asked if the soufflé would be much longer. 4 minutes, she said. She counted them. The soufflé came out perfect. Emily carried it to table 9 with both hands and set it down and said the things you said about a soufflé. Eat it now, it won't hold in joy. And the man in the blue blazer said it looked incredible. And his wife took a photograph of it, and Emily smiled at the photograph being taken and walked away and thought, there is a man in the room at the end of this restaurant who may be deciding right now whether I leave this building tonight. She had managed in the last 4 minutes to achieve something close to functional calm. Not real calm, functional. The kind you assembled from the outside in steady hands, level voice, correct expression, when the inside was running a completely different program. The alcove partition had not opened since Ethan Reeves went through it. That was 7 minutes ago. 7 minutes was long enough for many things. It was long enough for a conversation to reach its conclusion. Long enough for men who had been trained to move efficiently to make decisions and begin executing them. Long enough for whatever Victor Kane had decided to do next to already be in motion. It was also long enough for Daniel Voss to find his door. Emily was thinking about that, about the geometry of exits, about which direction a man ran, when the room closed around him, when the alcove partition opened, and one of Voss's men came out. Not Voss, one of his men, the one who had been near the wine corridor. He came through the partition at a pace designed to look unhurried, wearing the pleasant, vacant expression of someone who had been told to look like a dinner guest departing at the natural end of an evening. He moved across the main floor toward the entrance. Emily watched him from the service station. He was 3 tables from the door when Garrett came through the partition behind him. Garrett did not look pleasant. Garrett looked like a man who had been told to do a specific thing and was doing it with the particular economy of motion of someone who had done similar things many times. He crossed the main floor in 10 steps, touched the first man on the shoulder, and said something close to his ear that made the first man stop walking immediately. The couple at table 7 looked up. The man at table 9 paused with his fork halfway to his mouth. Emily said to no one, and everyone within range, "Can I get anyone a coffee refill?" said it in the warm, ordinary tone of a server making rounds, and the table 7 couple looked back at their dessert plates, and the man at table 9 resumed eating, and the small rupture in the ambient normalcy of the room sealed itself over. Garrett guided Voss's man back toward the partition. The man went. He did not look like he wanted to, but he went. Emily put the coffee carafe down and pressed her hand flat on the service counter and breathed through her nose. The floor was holding. The floor was still just a restaurant. She had 3 tables active, a couple waiting on their card to process, and Carlos moving through the far end with the steady competence of someone doing his job and paying very close attention. She caught his eye across the room. He gave her the smallest possible nod. She gave it back. And then the alcove partition opened for the 3rd time, and this time it was Victor Kane. He did not come through like a mist leaving a restaurant. He came through the way he had arrived, with the particular gravity of someone who displaced space rather than occupying, who moved through rooms as though the rooms had been arranged around the fact of his presence. He was not hurrying, he was not agitated. He was wearing the expression of a man who had resolved something and was now operating in the clean, decisive space that existed on the other side of resolution. He stopped in the middle of the main floor. He looked at Emily. Not a sweep, not a glance. He looked at her the way you looked at someone when you had already decided something about them and you were confirming it. She held the carafe. She did not look away. He said, "Come with me." Not a question. Not quite a command. The tone of a man who expected to be followed and was not accustomed to the expectation disappointing him. Emily set the carafe on the counter. She looked at Carlos, who was already moving to cover her section without being asked. She walked across the main floor and followed Victor Kane back through the alcove partition. The room was different now. The geometry had rearranged itself. Kane's men. Garrett and the other had positioned themselves near the 2 men who had come with Voss, who were now seated and very still in the way that people became still when they understood that the alternatives to stillness had been made explicit. Ethan Reeves stood at the far end of the table, his phone in his hand, his face doing nothing at all. Daniel Voss was still in his chair. He looked up when Emily entered, and something moved through his expression that she would think about for a long time afterward, not quite surprise, not quite recognition, but something in between. The look of a man who was backfilling information he should have already had. His eyes went from her to Victor and back to her, and she watched him run the calculation and arrive at the answer, and the answer visibly cost him something. "Her," he said. Victor pulled out a chair on the near side of the table, not at the center, not at the power position, just a chair, and gestured to it. Emily sat down. It was the strangest thing she had done all evening, and the evening had already contained several candidates for that distinction. Victor sat across from her, not across the full length of the table. He had pulled his chair around so that he was perhaps 4 feet away from her, close enough for a real conversation, close enough that she could see the small scar along his jawline that photographs never caught. "Tell me what you found him," he said. She told him. She told him about the tablecloth, the contact, the residue on her fingertips. She told him about Noah, about the dock, about the compound that entered through skin and did its work slowly and quietly and announced itself only when it was already finished. She kept her voice level. She did not editorialize. When she finished, Victor was quiet for 3 seconds. Then he said, "How certain were you?" "Certain enough," she said. "That's not a number." 80%, she said. "Maybe 85. I knew what it felt like on my skin. I knew what it had done before. I wasn't certain, but I was certain enough that doing nothing wasn't something I was going to be able to live with. Victor nodded once, not in the way of someone being placated, in the way of someone receiving a piece of information and filing it accurately. Across the table, Daniel Voss exhaled a long, carefully managed exhale that was trying very hard to sound like impatience. Victor, he said, this is a waitress. This is a waitress who overheard something she didn't understand and decided to insert herself into a private business dinner. Whatever she told you, whatever she thinks she found you, are about to make a very significant decision based on the interpretation of someone who serves food for a living. I need you to hear how that sounds. Emily did not look at him. She had decided somewhere in the walk across the main floor that she was not going to look at Daniel Voss unless she had a reason to. Victor said, Ethan. Reeves crossed to the near end of the table, crouched, and ran his hand along the underside near the edge. He stood up. He looked at Victor. He said nothing, but his face said it. The silence that followed that was the loudest thing Emily had heard all evening. Daniel Voss said, that means nothing. Anything could stop talking, Victor said. Voss stopped. It was that simple. Victor said 2 words at a normal conversational volume, and Daniel Voss, who had been charming rooms and managing optics and performing trust for the entirety of his professional life, simply stopped talking. Because the voice behind the words was not angry or theatrical, it was the voice of a verdict. Victor turned back to Emily. Why didn't you go to my security, he asked. Why didn't you tell Ethan? I didn't know which side he was on, she said. Reeves made a small sound that might under different circumstances have been a laugh. That's fair, Victor said. I also didn't know if telling anyone would get back to him. She tilted her head a fraction toward Voss without looking at him. A dinner this arranged has to have inside angles. I didn't know how many or where. Talking to the wrong person would have been the same as saying nothing except with worse consequences. Victor studied her. So you told me directly. I told you directly. 4 words. 4 words was enough. If you were smart enough to have survived everything people say you've survived, you were smart enough to know what to do with 4 words. Reeves made the sound again more definitively this time. Victor's expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted in a way that was almost not warm. That wasn't the right word, but something adjacent to it. The shift of a person who had just encountered something unexpected and was deciding how to hold it. Who else knows? He asked. Carlos, she said. A server. He knows something was wrong tonight and that I needed people away from this end of the building. He doesn't know specifics. That's all, Mayo? That's all. Victor nodded. Then he stood and Emily understood the conversation had entered its next register. He walked to the far end of the table and he looked at Daniel Voss, and what happened next was the thing she had been on the periphery of all evening and had never quite been able to see through the frosted glass. Here is what's true, Victor said. He was not performing. There was no theater in it. He spoke the way someone spoke when they had decided that the plain version of a thing was the only version worth saying. You arranged this dinner. You selected this restaurant. You selected this room. You arrived an hour before I did, which I noted and discounted because I believed it was preparation. I have reconsidered that. Voss opened his mouth. I'm not finished, Victor said. Voss closed it. You positioned 2 men at specific angles that had nothing to do with my security and everything to do with mine being occupied at the moment it mattered. You had something applied to the underside of this table at a position consistent with where I rest my hand, which is a habit you would only know from having observed me at multiple previous dinners, which means this was not an improvisation. Victor paused. This was designed, over time, carefully, which means you have been sitting across tables from me for however long this has been in development and performing trust. The room was so quiet that Emily could hear the main floor. Someone laughing at a joke, a glass being set down, the ambient sound of an ordinary evening in a restaurant where nobody knew what was happening 30 feet away. That part, Victor said, is the part I find most interesting. Not the attempt, the patience. You are a patient man, Daniel. I have always respected that about you. Voss found his voice. It was steadier than Emily would have expected. Victor, I want an attorney. You'll have one, Victor said. I imagine you'll have several before morning. They'll be very good attorneys. I'm sure you've already thought about which ones. Then I have nothing else to say to you. That's fine, Victor said. You don't need to say anything. The table said it. He turned away from Voss then with the finality of someone closing a door, and that gesture, that simple, unhurried turn, was the most violent thing Emily witnessed all evening. Not because it was aggressive, because it was conclusive. Daniel Voss ceased to be a variable worth addressing and became a solved problem, and the shift happened without a raised voice or a pointed finger or a single dramatic inflection. True power, Emily thought, didn't announce itself. It simply stopped explaining. Reeves was on his phone. Garrett had moved to the door. The other men were doing what they were doing, and it was being handled with the quiet efficiency of people who had protocols for exactly this situation and were now running them. Emily sat in her chair. Nobody had told her to leave. Nobody had told her to stay. She existed in the room in the same way she had existed in this restaurant all evening, as a presence that didn't fit the standard categories, which meant the standard rules didn't quite apply. She watched Victor Kane move through the room with his hands in his pockets, making 2 short phone calls, exchanging 4 words with Reeves, and looking out the window toward the harbor with the expression of a man recalculating something large. And she thought about the fact that she had been terrified of this man for 11 months. Not personally, she had never been this close to him before tonight, but in the general ambient way, you were terrified of weather systems or structural forces, forces that didn't need to notice you to damage you. He had noticed her. She was still processing what to do with that. He turned away from the window and crossed back toward her. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question was so straightforward, so absent of performance, that it took her a second to answer it. "Yes," she said. "Then I don't know. Ask me again in an hour." "Honest answer," he said. "I'm having an honest night." He almost smiled. She was not sure. The territory of Victor Kane's face near something resembling a smile was uncharted, and she did not want to misread it. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat back down, and she understood they were not finished. "Why did you do it?" he asked. She had known the question was coming. She had been turning the answer over since she walked back out to the main floor after washing her hands, since she stood in the service corridor and listened to Reeves on the phone, since she pressed 2 fingers against the back of Garrett's chair and trusted that it would mean something. "My brother," she said. "I told you about my brother. That's the honest beginning of it. I recognized what I felt under that table because of what happened to Noah, and I knew what it meant, and I couldn't unknow it. But," she looked at him. "But what?" "There's a but," he said. "You're not finished." She held his gaze for a moment. "But I also knew that if something happened to you in this room tonight, the people who would be standing in a precinct at 2 in the morning would be Carlos and Martha and Raymond, the dishwasher, and a prep cook who is already scared every day of his life. And their version of tonight wouldn't be the version that anyone important bothered to protect." Victor was quiet. "You can take care of yourself," Emily said. "You have attorneys and resources and 11 years of Ethan Reeves. The people in this building who cannot take care of themselves are the people nobody in this room was thinking about." She paused. "I was thinking about them." Something moved behind Victor Kane's eyes that she couldn't name and didn't try to. "So I wasn't saving you," she said. "Not exactly. I was saving them from being in the room where you died." The silence lasted long enough to feel like an answer. Then Reeves appeared at Victor's shoulder and said something quiet, and Victor stood, and the room began its next phase of managed methodical activity. Emily stood too, and that was when she heard it from the direction of the main entrance, at a volume that punched clean through the partition, a voice she recognized because she had heard it perform Warmth all evening, and she now understood exactly what performed Warmth sounded like stripped of its performance. Daniel Voss, not from inside the alcove, from the main floor. Somehow in the 4 minutes of movement and phone calls and reorganized geometry, he had found his door. Garrett was already moving. Reeves was already moving. And Emily, who was standing closest to the partition, who had been moving through this building all evening, with the institutional knowledge of someone who knew every creak in every corridor, pushed through the door first. She came through to the main floor in time to see Daniel Voss at the host station 40 feet away, with his jacket over one arm and his phone in his hand, and the expression of a man performing a casual departure for the benefit of a room full of witnesses. He was talking to Martha. "Wonderful evening," he was saying. "Please thank the kitchen. The halibut was exceptional." Martha was looking at him the way you looked at something that was wrong, but that you could not name the wrongness of fast enough to stop it from happening. "Mr. Voss," Martha said, and her voice had a slight break in it that she covered with a professional smile. Emily walked across the main floor. She did not run. Running was wrong. Running turned a room. She walked at the pace of a woman who had somewhere to be in this building and was moving there with purpose. Voss saw her coming. His expression recalibrated in real time. She watched it happen, watched the warmth adjust, watched him decide what version of himself to present to this specific obstacle. He chose pleasant. He chose the version that had been working all evening. "Lovely service tonight," he said to her as she arrived at the host station. He said it to her the way you said it to a server, appreciatively, dismissively, both at once. "Genuinely, please tell your team." "Mr. Voss," Emily said, "I think you left something in the alcove." He looked at her. The pleasantness stayed on his face, but something behind it went very, very still. "I don't believe I did," he said. "I think you did," she said. "I think Mr. Kane wanted to return it to you personally." And Garrett came through the partition, and Reeves came through the partition. And Daniel Voss looked at the two of them, and then looked at Emily, and the pleasant expression finally completely let go, not into anger, not into panic, but into something flat and cold and honest. The first honest expression she had seen from him all evening. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He turned around and walked with the men flanking him at a distance designed to look like accompaniment, rather than escort, back across the main floor, back through the partition, and back into the room he had been trying to leave. Martha stood at the host station looking at Emily. "What," Martha said quietly, "is happening in my restaurant?" Emily looked at her manager, at the woman who had been afraid all evening, and managing it the only way she knew, and said the truest available version of it. "It's being handled," she said. "Your people are safe. Keep the floor running." Martha stared at her. "Martha," Emily kept her voice low and even. "Keep the floor running." Martha straightened. She picked up her clipboard. She went back to work. And Emily turned and walked back across the main floor, past table 7 and table 9 and the couple whose card had finally processed, and she pushed through the alcove partition, and she went back into the room where everything had happened, because she was not finished yet. She did not know exactly what she was not finished with. She only knew she hadn't left. The alcove was quieter now in the way that rooms got quiet after something large had moved through them. Daniel Voss was back in his chair. He had stopped performing. That was the most significant change, the absence of the performance, the way a room felt different when the largest sound in it simply ceased. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the middle distance, in the expression of a man who had run his calculations and arrived at a number he did not like and was now accepting the arithmetic. Garrett stood near the door. Reeves was on his phone in the corner, speaking in a voice too low to carry. The other men were where they needed to be, doing what they needed to do with the quiet, practiced efficiency of people. For whom this kind of evening was not entirely without precedent. Victor Kane was standing at the window again. Emily stood just inside the partition, not quite part of the room and not quite outside it, and nobody told her to move, and nobody acknowledged her presence, and she occupied that ambiguity the way she had occupied ambiguous spaces all her life, by being still and paying attention. She was very good at paying attention. What she was paying attention to now was the back of Victor Kane's head and the set of his shoulders, and the particular quality of the silence he was generating, which was different from the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had a great deal to say and was deciding how much of it was necessary. He turned away from the window. "Leave us," he said. Reeves looked up from his phone. "Victor." "I know where you'll be," Victor said. "Leave us." Reeves looked at Emily. The look was not hostile. It was the look of a man performing a rapid security assessment of a 29-year-old woman in an apron, and then he nodded once and gestured to Garrett, and the room emptied with the smooth, unhurried efficiency that seemed to characterize every movement in Victor Kane's orbit. Voss's men were guided out. Garrett followed. Reeves went last, pulling the partition door shut behind him. The room was now Victor Kane, Daniel Voss, and Emily Carter. Emily thought, "This is the strangest place I have ever stood in my life." Victor pulled out the chair he had been using earlier and sat down again. He did not look at Voss. He looked at Emily and said, "Sit down." She sat. Voss said without inflection, "This is irregular." "Yes," Victor agreed. He still did not look at him. "She stays. She's a witness." She was already a witness. She's been a witness since the moment she walked in here and found what you put under my table. Victor finally turned his gaze to Voss, and the quality of it, flat, unhurried, completely without heat, was more unsettling than anger would have been. What she is specifically is the reason this conversation is happening at a table instead of somewhere considerably less comfortable for you. You might consider what that's worth before you object to her presence again. Voss said nothing. Victor looked back at Emily. I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it the same way you've answered everything else tonight. Okay, she said. When you walked out of here after those 4 words when you went back to the floor, what were you thinking? She considered the question honestly. I was thinking about whether you'd heard me, and then whether you believed me. And then I was thinking about whether Daniel Voss had seen my lips move, and whether that meant someone was going to follow me out of this building. And after that, I was thinking about Carlos and Raymond and the prep cook in the kitchen. The same thing I told you before. Victor nodded slowly. Not about yourself. I thought about myself too, she said. I'm not going to pretend I was pure about it. I thought about my mom and my mother and what it would mean if this went badly for me. But that wasn't the center of it. What was the center of it? She looked at him directly. The center of it was that I've spent my entire adult life watching what happens when powerful men have a problem. The problem gets solved. And the people who were standing nearby when the problem happened are the ones who pay for the solution. I've seen it with my brother. I've seen it with the dock workers who got exposed to the same compound he did and then couldn't get compensation because the company's attorneys were faster than their union rep. I've seen it in this restaurant customers who cause scenes, customers who behave badly, and it's always the server who gets written up because the server is the easiest person to manage. She paused. I didn't save you because I wanted to be in your world. I saved the people in this building from being destroyed by whatever was about to happen in it. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Daniel Voss laughed. It was not the warm manufactured laugh from earlier in the evening. It was something rawer than that, not quite bitter, not quite genuine, somewhere in the uncomfortable territory between. He laughed and then he stopped and he said, that is genuinely impressive. You have worked out a way to be both a hero and a martyr without having done anything yet. Emily looked at him for the first time since she had sat down. Mr. Voss, she said, I don't think I'm a hero. A hero doesn't spend 6 minutes standing in a service corridor convincing herself that someone else's life is worth the risk to her own. A hero just acts. I spent 6 minutes doing math. She kept her eyes on his. The math came out in a direction I could live with. That's all this was. Voss held her gaze. Something moved through his expression. Not remorse, not that, but something in the neighborhood of it. The recognition of a person who had been seen accurately by someone he had not bothered to see at all. He looked away first. Victor said, what do you need? Emily turned back to him. I'm sorry, tonight, tomorrow, going forward. What do you need? She understood this was the offer arriving. She had known it was coming, from the moment Victor Kane asked Ethan Reeves to leave the room, and she had been turning over her answer for the last several minutes. I need my staff left out of this, she said. Whatever happens next, whatever investigation, whatever legal process, whatever narrative gets constructed about tonight, the people who work in this restaurant had nothing to do with it and need to not be part of it. Done, Victor said immediately. Martha included. She was afraid tonight. She didn't do anything wrong, she was just afraid, and I don't want that held against her. Done. And I need this restaurant to stay open. The people here need their jobs. Victor looked at her steadily. Is that all? She held his gaze. That's what I need. That's not what I'm asking. His voice was even, careful in the specific way of someone choosing precision over efficiency. I'm asking whether you understand the scope of what you did tonight, and whether you understand what that is worth in practical terms, and whether you are making a deliberate choice to ask for less than that. Emily was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said, I'm making a deliberate choice. Why? The question sat in the room. She thought about how to answer it honestly. And the honest answer was complicated, and she tried to give it without simplifying it into something easier. Because the version of tonight where I walk out of here with money, mercy, and a position in a future inside your organization is a version where I've become something I don't recognize. I came into this room because invisible people were going to get hurt. If I leave it with a reward for that, the invisible people that still got used. Just by me this time, instead of by whoever arranged what was under that table. Across the table, she heard Voss exhale quietly. It was not the exhale of contempt. It was something more complicated than that. Victor looked at her for a long moment. You're not going to let me do anything for you. I didn't say that, Emily said. He waited. My brother, she said. Noah, he's 26. His kidneys are at 62% function and have been for 3 years. He does physical therapy twice a week and it helps, and he can't always afford to go. He works part-time at a hardware store, and he's careful about it, and he doesn't complain. She kept her voice level. He didn't deserve what happened to him on that dock. The people who were responsible for the compound being there had attorneys who were very good, and Noah had a union rep who tried hard, and there was never any compensation. Victor said nothing. I'm not asking you to fix that, Emily said. I know that's not something that gets fixed. I'm just telling you that he exists and that he is why I knew what I knew tonight, and that the compound under that table has a face for me. It's his face, yellow and 19 years old in a hospital bed. She stopped. I wanted you to know that. The silence that followed was different from the other silences of the evening. It had a texture to it, something human in it. Victor said, "What's his name?" Noah Carter. What hospital manages his care? She told him. She did not ask why. She had a feeling she knew why, and she was making a decision about whether to let that be what it was going to be. And by the time she finished saying the hospital's name, she had made the decision. She would let it be what it was going to be. Victor nodded. He stood. He walked to the far end of the table where Voss sat with his hands still flat on the surface, and he looked down at the man who had arranged this evening with patience and precision, and he said quietly, "The attorneys will be here within the hour. You'll want to use that hour to decide what you're telling them, because what you tell them tonight will determine what the next several years of your life look like." Voss looked up at him. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm telling you the truth, Victor said. "I find it's more useful than a threat. A threat gives a man something to fight against. The truth just sits there." He walked toward the partition. Then he stopped. He turned back and looked at Emily, and the question he asked her was not one she had prepared for. "Are you afraid of me?" he said. She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, for 3 or 4 full seconds. "Not right now," she said. "Ask me again when this is over." For the second time that evening, something in his face moved toward a territory she didn't have a word for. "Fair answer," he said. He went through the partition. Emily sat alone in the room with Daniel Voss. This was not something she had anticipated. She looked at the table. She looked at the partition. She considered standing up and leaving, which she could do. Nobody had told her otherwise. Nobody was physically preventing it, and she stayed in her chair because the room still felt unfinished to her, and she had not quite identified why. Voss said, "How old is your brother?" She looked at him. 26. He nodded slowly. He was looking at the table, not at her, at the table in the way that people looked at surfaces when they were seeing something else entirely. "I have a daughter," he said. "She's 24. He said it without apparent agenda, without performing anything, just a fact spoken into the room. "She doesn't know what I do, the full version of it. She knows I work in finance and investment, and that we've always had more than we needed, and she has a version of me that is—" He stopped. "She has a version of me that I'm aware is not accurate." Emily said nothing. "Tonight," Voss said, "she texted me a photograph of her apartment. She just moved in somewhere in Austin. She was proud of it." He looked at the partition. "I sent back a heart emoji and came back to this table to wait for the timing to be right." The room was quiet. Emily did not feel sorry for him. She was clear about that internally. The clarity was important. She needed to maintain it. But she felt something, some thin thread of recognition that she did not want to examine too closely, because Daniel Voss was a man who had decided that some people were worth more than others and had acted on that decision with patience and precision, and she had spent her entire life being one of the people on the wrong side of that calculation. Still, the daughter in Austin proud of her apartment. "Why are you telling me that?" Emily asked. "I don't know," he said, and the quality of his voice when he said it, unsteady for the first time all evening, suggested he was being accurate. She stood up. She straightened her apron. She picked up the bread basket from the edge of the table which she had carried in at some point and set down and forgotten about, and she held it because her hands needed something to do. "Mr. Voss," she said, "what you almost did tonight, I'm not going to pretend I understand the world you operate in well enough to judge all of it, but what you almost did to the people in this building who had nothing to do with your problem with Victor Kane, the ones who would have been standing in a precinct at 2 a.m. trying to explain something they didn't know anything about. That's not something I can find a version of. That makes sense." He didn't answer. Your daughter in Austin, Emily said. She's proud of her apartment. That's good. That's a good thing. She paused. I hope she gets to keep that version of you for as long as possible. She walked to the partition and pushed through it. The main floor was still a restaurant. That was the thing that kept striking her, that on the other side of that frosted glass, the world continued with the perfect normalcy of a world that did not know what was happening 30 feet away. Table 7 had gotten their check. The man at table 9 was finishing the soufflé. Carlos was moving through the far section with the steady, careful competence that she was now understanding had always been there, had just needed the right circumstances to become visible. She walked to the service station and put the breadbasket down. Reeves materialized from the direction of the entrance. He crossed the floor to her with the direct, efficient pace that seemed to be his natural mode of movement. Victor wants to know if you need a car tonight, he said. She looked at him. A car. Home. He wants to make sure you get home. She considered this. Is that a resource offer or a surveillance offer? Reeves almost smiled. It was the most expression she had seen from him. It's a resource offer. You have my word. Your word, she said. I've worked for this man for 11 years, Reeves said. My word is not a small thing. She believed him. She did not know exactly why she believed him, except that 11 years of working for someone complicated was its own kind of testimony. And the voice she had heard in the service corridor, the voice that said, if he walks out of this restaurant tonight, this is over, was the voice of a person whose loyalty was structural rather than transactional. Tell him thank you, she said. I'll take the bus. Reeves studied her for a moment. He's not going to forget tonight. I know, she said. I mean that in a specific way, not a threatening way, a specific way. I understand, she said. He nodded once and walked back toward the entrance. Emily picked up a coffee carafe from the warming station. She looked at the main floor at table 7 and table 9, and Carlos, who was currently taking an order from a couple she hadn't seen come in. New customers arriving at 10:15 for a late dinner because the night continued and the restaurant continued, and the world outside the alcove did not stop for the things that happened inside it. She walked to table 7, where the couple had lingered over their last glasses of wine. Can I get you anything else? She asked. The woman smiled at her. Just the check, I think. It was a wonderful evening. I'm glad, Emily said. She meant it. She was glad the evening had been wonderful for someone. The evening had been many things for many people, and wonderful was a good one to add to the list. She printed the check. She brought it over. She said the things you said at the end of a table, the gracious, warm, professionally genuine things that good servers knew how to mean even on the nights when meaning them required more than usual. She was halfway through her last round of the floor when Martha appeared at her elbow. The private room is cleared, Martha said. Her voice was controlled, but thinner than usual, stretched at the seams. The alcove is empty. There are men outside. I don't know who they are, but they're handling something, and I haven't been told what, and I need you to tell me what I need to know to run this restaurant. Emily looked at her manager. She thought about everything Martha deserved to know and everything that knowing it would cost her. The situation has been handled, Emily said. Nobody in this building is in any danger. Nobody in this building did anything wrong. The restaurant is not involved. Emily, Martha. She kept her voice quiet and even. I know that's not enough. I know you need more than that. And I promise you, when there is something I can tell you fully, I will tell you. She held her manager's gaze. But right now, what you need to run this restaurant is what I just gave you. Nobody is in danger. Nobody did anything wrong. The restaurant is not involved. Martha looked at her for a long moment. She was a practical woman. She had built a practical life. She ran a practical floor and protected her staff in the practical, unglamorous way that practical people protected things by showing up, by paying attention, by managing the next 10 minutes well enough to get to the 10 minutes after that. She said, "Are you all right?" Emily felt something unexpected move through her chest at the question. Just that. "Are you all right?" said without agenda, without management, calculation, just a person asking another person the basic human question. "I will be," Emily said. Martha nodded. She straightened her jacket. She went back to her floor. And Emily stood at the service station with a coffee carafe in her hand and felt for the first time since 8:47 something that was not fear or adrenaline or the compressed, shaking focus of a person managing a crisis. She felt tired. Not the bone-deep tired of a double shift or the hollow tired of not enough sleep. The specific tired of having carried something very heavy for several hours and being in the moment just after you had set it down when your arms still held the shape of the weight, but the weight itself was gone. She set the carafe on the counter. She checked the clock above the service station. 11:12, 43 minutes. She had been standing inside this particular 43 minutes for what felt like a year, and it had been 43 minutes, and outside the restaurant, the harbor was still moving, and the city was still running, and Noah was presumably asleep in his apartment, with the Dolphins meme phone dark on his nightstand, and her mother had called 3 times and Emily had not answered any of them, and in the morning everything would still be the same, except for the part of it that would be different forever. She picked up her phone from the apron pocket. She called her mother back. It rang twice. "Emily, honey, it's almost 11:30. "I know, Mom," she said. "I know. I'm sorry I missed your calls. Is everything okay?" She looked at the main floor, at Carlos and the new couple, and the last table finishing their wine, at the partition still and frosted and giving nothing away. "Yeah," she said. "Everything's okay." She paused. "How's Noah?" "He had a good day. He sent me something about dolphins." Emily smiled. It came out of her before she could decide to do it. "He sent me one too. He's been in better spirits. I think the therapy is helping." "Good," she said. "That's good." She kept her voice steady. "Mom, I'll be home after close. Don't wait up, but I'll call you before I get on the bus." "Okay, baby." "Okay." She paused. "I love you. I love you too. Be careful." She hung up and stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. "Be careful." She laughed very quietly to herself. Then she put the phone in her apron pocket, picked up the carafe, and went back to work. The restaurant closed at midnight. Emily was the last server out of the building, which was not unusual. She had always been the last one out. It was the kind of thing that happened when you needed the hours and didn't have anywhere urgent to be, and had trained yourself over years to find a certain safety in the structured predictability of closing work, wiping down stations, restocking linen, walking the floor one final time to make sure everything was set for morning. Tonight, the closing work felt different. Her hands were doing the familiar things, and her mind was somewhere else, entirely running back through the evening in the fragmented, non-linear way that minds process things they hadn't finished with yet. Carlos had hugged her before he left. He was 19 years old, and he had hugged her with the straightforward, uncomplicated warmth of someone who didn't have the vocabulary for what he wanted to say, and had decided physical expression was more honest anyway. She had hugged him back. She had told him he'd done well tonight. He'd said, "I didn't do anything." And she'd said, "Yes, you did." And he'd nodded in the way of someone filing that away for later, when he'd have more context to understand it. Martha had turned off the lights in the alcove herself. Emily had watched her do it, had watched her manager walk through the partition and stand in that room for 30 seconds alone, before flipping the switch and coming back out with her clipboard tight under her arm and her expression sealed into the professional composure she wore when she was protecting herself from the weight of something. She hadn't said anything to Emily. Emily hadn't said anything to her. Some things sat better in silence, at least for a while. The bus home took 22 minutes. Emily sat in the back, her apron folded in her lap, her phone dark in her hand. She had called her mother before boarding as promised. She had said the night had been long and she was fine, and she'd explain later which was the Carter family code for something happened and I'm not ready to talk about it yet, and please trust me when I say I'm okay. Her mother had said, "Okay, baby." That was the whole conversation. Outside the bus window, Baltimore moved past in the particular nighttime language of a Harbor City water reflections loading dock. Lights the orange glow of streets that never fully went dark. She had grown up inside the city's rhythms. She knew its sounds and its textures and its specific brand of beauty, which was not the beauty of a postcard, but the beauty of a place that had been through things and was still standing. She thought about what Reeves had said. He's not going to forget tonight. She believed it. She didn't know what to do with it, but she believed it. She got home at 12:47. The apartment was the apartment as small, warm the particular arranged chaos of a space shared by two people who had learned to live around each other's stuff without discussing it. Her mother's reading glasses on the kitchen table. A half-finished cup of tea gone cold. Noah's jacket on the hook by the door, which meant he had stopped by at some point during the evening. She sat on the couch and did not turn on the television and sat in the quiet for a while. She expected to feel something large. Relief, maybe? Or fear? or the crash that came after adrenaline burned itself out completely. What she actually felt was an odd, quiet, almost peaceful clarity. The kind that came not from resolution, but from having made a choice you could stand behind. She had made one. She was standing behind it. She went to bed at 1:15. She slept. That surprised her most of all. 3 days passed. She worked her regular shifts. She poured wine and carried trays and smiled at the appropriate moments, and comped desserts when orders came out slow, and managed her section with the grinding, anxious precision that had always been her professional signature. The restaurant ran as it had always run. Martha managed the floor with the efficient, practical authority of a woman who had decided that the best response to an inexplicable event was to make everything around it as explicable as possible. The alcove was reserved twice in those 3 days. Emily served both tables. She straightened tablecloths and poured water and did not think too specifically about the last time she had run her hand along the underside of a table in that room. On the second day, Carlos brought her a coffee from the place down the block that she liked. He set it on the service station next to her without saying anything. She looked at it and then at him. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I wanted to," he said. "You doing okay?" "Getting there," she said. He nodded. He went back to his section. On the third morning, she woke up to a voicemail from a number she didn't recognize. Baltimore area code. She listened to it standing in her kitchen, in her socks, coffee in the other hand. It was a woman's voice. Professional, warm, specific. She introduced herself as the patient advocate coordinator at the hospital that managed Noah's care. She said she was calling because there had been an update to Noah Carter's account that an anonymous benefactor had cleared the outstanding physical therapy balance in full, and that an additional fund had been established for ongoing treatment costs for the next 2 years, and that if Emily had any questions about the arrangement, she was welcome to call back. Emily stood in her kitchen for a long time after the voicemail ended. She did not call back. She called Noah. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, what's up?" "Did you hear from the hospital?" she said. A pause. "Yeah." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a while, a lightness, careful, like he wasn't sure it was real yet, but there. "This morning I was going to call you." "What did they tell you?" "That someone paid off my balance, like all of it, and set up money for the next 2 years. Another pause. "Emily, what happened?" She leaned against the counter. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about Noah, 19 years old, yellow-faced in a hospital bed, and Noah, now 26, working part-time at a hardware store and texting her memes about dolphins on good pain days. "Something happened at work," she said, "and I helped someone, and they did this." "Who?" "It's complicated." "Emily." "Noah." She took a breath. "It's good. It's a good thing. I need you to let it be a good thing." He was quiet for a moment. She could hear him thinking through it, the particular quality of his silence when he was deciding something. "Okay," he said finally. "Okay. If you say it's good, I trust you." He paused. "Is this because of that thing you couldn't tell me about?" She almost laughed. "When did I say there was a thing I couldn't tell you about?" "You didn't, but you've had a voice for 3 days, like you're holding something with both hands." She pressed her lips together. 26 years old, and he still knew her better than most people twice his age. "Yeah," she said, "it's because of that thing." "You okay? Getting better every day?" "Good," he said. "That's good." A beat. "I'm going to physical therapy on Thursday, both sessions." "Good," she said. "That's really good, Noah." After she hung up, she stayed in the kitchen for another 5 minutes, not doing anything. Just standing, letting the morning be the morning. Then she poured the rest of her coffee down the drain, put on her jacket, and went to work. The envelope appeared in her locker on the 6th day. Not a thick envelope, not dramatic, just a standard white envelope with her name written on the front in handwriting that was precise and minimal, and told her nothing about who had left it because she already knew who had left it. She held it for a long time before she opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, and behind it a card with a phone number and nothing else. No name, no organization, just a number. The paper said in the same handwriting, "The staff at this restaurant will not be touched. That is not a conditional statement." And below that, one more line: "If you ever need to reach someone, the number on the card reaches someone who knows how to find me." She read it twice. She folded it back up. She put it and the card in the inside pocket of her jacket, which was as close to her as anything got, and she changed into her work apron and went out to the floor. Martha was at the host station with her clipboard. She looked up when Emily came out. "You've got sections 4 and 5 tonight," she said. "Got it," Emily said. Martha looked at her for a moment, the particular look of a woman who had more to say than she was going to say, which Emily recognized because she wore it herself fairly often. "You did good," Martha said. "Whatever happened, I don't know the full version, but you did good." Emily held her manager's gaze. "You did too," she said. "You kept the floor running." Martha almost smiled. "That's what I know how to do." "That's not a small thing," Emily said. Martha looked at her clipboard. She made a note on it that probably didn't need to be made. "Okay, sections 4 and 5. Emily picked up a carafe and went to work. The weeks that followed had an odd texture to them. Not bad, not particularly dramatic, just different in the way that ordinary life felt different after you had stood inside something extraordinary and come out the other side, like the ordinary life was the same size it had always been, and you were slightly different dimensions, and the fit was still being worked out. She picked up fewer overtime shifts. This was not a financial decision. The physical therapy money had not changed her own situation, not directly, but something in her relationship to the grinding accumulation of hours had shifted. She still worked hard. She still showed up early and stayed late and did the job with the precision that had always been her default. She just stopped operating from the particular desperation that had been running underneath everything for so long, she had forgotten it was there. Her mother noticed. "You're sleeping," her mother said one Sunday over the phone. "I usually sleep," Emily said. "Not like this. You've been sleeping like you used to when you were a kid, before the bills." Emily didn't answer immediately. "Something happened," her mother said, not a question. "Yeah," Emily said. "Something happened." Good something or bad something, Emily thought about the alcove, about the frosted glass and the 4 words and the bread basket and Carlos and Garrett and Reeves saying, "He's not going to forget tonight." "Good," she said. "It was a good something." Her mother was quiet for a moment. "You're going to tell me eventually." "Eventually," Emily agreed. "Okay," her mother said. "Okay, baby." 2 months after the dinner, Emily was on the bus home from a morning shift when her phone buzzed with a news alert. She did not usually read news alerts. She clicked this one because the name in the headline was a name she recognized: Daniel Voss. The article was brief and not particularly dramatic, which she was beginning to understand was the way things in that world actually worked. He had stepped down from the board of his primary investment firm. Effective immediately, the statement said. Pursuing other interests, the kind of language that meant nothing and communicated everything to the people who knew how to read it. There were no criminal charges mentioned, no investigation named publicly, just a man who had been at negotiation tables and on boards and in rooms that mattered, and who was now quietly not. She thought about what Victor had said, that the question was whether it's you or him. She thought about the daughter in Austin, proud of her apartment. She closed the article and put her phone away. She did not feel triumphant. She didn't feel sorry either. She felt something more neutral and more real than either of those, the feeling of a thing having reached its logical conclusion, the way an equation resolved when you finally had all the numbers in the right places. She got off at her stop. The day after that, she applied for a job. Not a big thing. A small restaurant in Providence, Rhode Island, family-owned, 3 years old, good reviews on the community boards she had been quietly reading for several months. The posting said they were looking for an experienced server with a genuine commitment to hospitality, which she had always found a slightly awkward way to phrase it, but which she understood the intention behind. She wrote the application the way she did everything with care, without drama, telling the truth about her experience and her skills and what she was looking for. She sent it on a Thursday. They called her on a Saturday. She had the interview on a Tuesday, took the bus up, wore the gray blazer she kept for things that required a gray blazer, and sat across from a couple in their 60s named Paul and Diane, who had opened the restaurant after Paul retired from teaching high school history, and Diane finished raising their kids, and they had looked at each other and said, "Why not?" Paul asked her why she wanted to leave Baltimore. She thought about it honestly. "I've been here my whole life," she said. "I know it very well. I think I've been here long enough that the knowing it has started to feel like a ceiling instead of a foundation." Paul nodded like a man who had taught 17-year-olds to think for 28 years and recognized the shape of a genuine answer. Diane asked whether she had family obligations that might affect availability. "My mother and my brother," Emily said, "but they're stable. We've had a difficult few years and we've come through it. They're stable." She said that last sentence with a conviction that was new. Stable. They had not been stable for so long that saying the word felt like something she was claiming for the first time, like planting a flag in ground that had previously been too uncertain to hold one. She got the job. She called Noah first. Providence, he said. Providence. That's like 4 hours. 3.5, she said. I looked it up. Emily. His voice was even, careful. Are you good? Yeah, she said. I'm really good. A pause. Then I think you should go. You do? You've been carrying this city on your back since you were 22 years old, he said. That's not living there. That's just not leaving. He paused. Go. We'll visit. She left on a Friday morning in early spring. Her mother helped her pack, which meant her mother stood in the middle of the bedroom offering opinions on the folding of sweaters, while Emily did the actual folding. They had dinner together the night before. Noah came. He brought the good takeout from the place on Federal Hill that they only got on important occasions. They sat around the table and ate and talked and did not make it into a big thing, which was the Carter family's most reliable way of communicating that something was a very big thing. Before she left, her mother hugged her in the doorway for a long time. Be careful, she said. Mom, Emily said into her shoulder. I know. You always are. Her mother pulled back and looked at her. But be careful anyway. Noah walked her to the car she'd borrowed. He handed her the coffee he'd bought for the road. He looked at her with a particular expression he had always worn when he was proud of her and didn't want to make it weird. Hey, he said. Hey. Whatever you did, he said, at that restaurant, whatever happened that you can't fully tell me about. He held her gaze. You did the right thing. She looked at her brother, at his face, which was 26 and tired around the eyes in the specific way of someone who had been through something physical and prolonged, but which was also good fundamentally, clearly good the way some faces just were. Yeah, she said, I know. She drove north on 95 with the coffee in the cup holder and the radio on low, and the particular feeling of a person who was not running away from something, but moving towards something which felt entirely different in the body, lighter through the shoulders, clearer in the chest. She thought about the alcove. She thought about 4 words spoken at the volume of a private decision. She thought about a breadbasket and a coffee carafe, and 2 fingers pressed against the back of a chair. She thought about the way power moved in that room, not through noise, not through threat, but through the quiet certainty of people who knew what they were doing and did it without apology. She had been one of those people. She had not known it until she was in the middle of doing it, but she had been one of them. The Providence restaurant was small and warm and smelled like bread and good coffee and the particular organized energy of a kitchen that was running well. Paul and Diane were exactly who they had seemed to be in the interview, decent, unhurried people who had built something they were proud of and wanted to protect. The most dramatic thing that happened in her first week was a tourist who complained that the salmon was overcooked, which it wasn't, but she comped his dessert anyway because it was easier, and he seemed like a man who needed to feel heard more than he needed to be right. She slept differently in Providence. Deeper. Quieter. The kind of sleep her mother had noticed returning in the last weeks in Baltimore, but more settled now, more complete. She woke up without the immediate ambient calculation of bills and shifts in margins that had been the first sound in her head every morning for years. She woke up and made coffee and looked out the window at a street she was still learning and felt clearly and without exaggeration like a person with a future. Not a dramatic future, not a transformed one, just a future that belonged to her in a way that the previous version of her life had not quite managed. Noah started both physical therapy sessions every week. Her mother opened the mailbox without shaking hands. Daniel Voss stopped appearing at tables that mattered. And Victor Kane remained what he had always been, complicated, dangerous, disciplined, and in possession of a memory that held things without softening them, but in one private corner of a life that most people would never see clearly. He remembered a Tuesday evening in Baltimore when a waitress with a bread basket and a borrowed certainty had said 4 words that cost her everything she was afraid of and nothing she couldn't afford to lose. Emily Carter never called herself brave. She knew what brave felt like from the outside, and it didn't feel like what she had done. Brave people didn't spend 6 minutes in a service corridor doing the math. Brave people didn't tremble against a wall with a bread basket in both hands. Brave people, in her understanding, didn't have to talk themselves into it. But she had walked into that room anyway. She had spoken anyway. And the word for a person who does the necessary thing despite the trembling, despite the math, despite every practical reason the world has handed them to look the other way. She didn't know that word, and she didn't need to. She just knew what she had done, and she knew it had been enough.